smile. Everybody's on camera now. So if you need a copy of the recording, let me know. I'm going to try not to go over tonight. I want to be respectful of your time, but it's such a fun area to talk about. We can't talk about all of South Africa tonight. Unfortunately, there really is a big diversity of wine styles and also appellation within South Africa. So we'll dive into the appellation system, the world of origin system, of course, because that's such an integral part of what we do when it comes to understanding wine, right? And we all know that. We'll talk about the history, my favorite. And I think this is so fascinating because uh, the wine history of South Africa is quite different than really any other wine growing region. And I find that to be very exciting. They've gone through a lot. And really we'll talk about their wine history, of course, starting in the 1600s, but their modern wine history is congruent with their modern democracy, which is something that's really interesting. And South Africa has, in a very short period of time, with their modern democracy and their modern wine region, they've really built a model for sustainability, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today, both social sustainability, economic sustainability, environmental sustainability, that I find to be something that's really of a lot of importance. And I think that in a very short period of time, since 1994, they've really built a wine region and a wine culture worthy of even old world wine regions being able to turn to and sort of look to for inspiration and as a model. Now we're in the Southern Hemisphere in this case, of course, the end of our Southern Hemisphere series. I can't believe that we're almost done with our World of Wine series, which we've gone through. I feel just so quickly in the past several months. It's in September, I think. So a lot happening with this, but we'll talk about quite a bit today. I'm really excited. As I usually am, but so I'm drinking tonight. I think most of you know kind of the whole drill, right? So we are going to put everybody on mute, not because I don't want to hear from you, but just because maybe there's barking dogs in the background, or perhaps we have a little bit of, dinner being made. So we'll just avoid any of those sort of awkward noises in the background, but please take yourself off of mute if you have anything to say, because I want to hear from you. So normally, there we go. Normally I mute everybody before I share my screen. So it took me a moment to find all this technology. Can you believe I'm still like, where is this button located? 9 months into teaching classes on Zoom several days a week. Anyways, we learn something new every day, right? It's really fun. So we're touring South Africa today. One of the last stops in our World of Wine series. I think it's really appropriate that it's one of the last stops in the series, because here we have a wine region that's considered to be a new world wine region. It's outside of Europe, but they have a very long history. They have a very European history when it comes to the cultivation of grapes and making wine. And I think something that's really interesting about South Africa is that they know their birth date for wine. I can't really think of another wine region where they can put the birth date down to the day and the year that this actually happened, that they first made wine. So this is really fascinating. We'll talk about that background. We're going to talk about the history and why is it important, because it tells us what we need to know for the context of why South African wine is the way that it is today. And there's so much history here to talk about. We'll talk about the wine laws, of course, that gives us a better understanding of how to purchase wine, how to purchase the best wine from South Africa. We'll talk about the culture and the international reputation. And for those who may have joined a little bit after I asked this question, but one of the questions I was saying, when we used to do in-person classes at Cork Buzz, one of the questions I always like to ask at the beginning of class was, what's your impression about South Africa, right? Or whatever class it was. But South Africa is a great one. And I would hear things like, Jeff mentioned things like Chenin Blanc. And Pinotage, of course, yes, two of the most important grapes within this region. But he also mentioned things about, we talked about the price point, we talked about the international reputation, and really how people perceive the wine coming out of these areas. And we'll talk about the classic wine growing areas. So we're going to break it down into, I kind of like to say that, and I learned this from my good friend Jim Clark, who worked for WOSA, Wines of South Africa. He's the marketing manager for WOSA, essentially kind of their brand ambassador. And he always liked to say that there's really three sort of ways that you need to look at the wine growing areas of South Africa. One is the classic or historic areas. So this would include places like Constantia, Stellenbosch, Paarl would be really important. The second would be the rediscovered regions. So these would be areas that were historically important for wine production, but then that reputation languished for quite some time. So that would include places, really importantly, like the Swartland, I think, is one of those areas within the Breede River Valley, particularly places like Robertson are really important for these sort of rediscovered or reinvigorated areas. And then we have these sort of new kids on the block, right? So most of the new kids on the block are in the Cape South Coast. And these are areas that are really being developed now or within the past decade or two, where historically there was not the production of wine. So we're going to talk about all of these super fun places within South Africa. So let's take a look at a map of South Africa. Now, there are three maps, I think, that really help put into perspective where we are on the African continent. It really helped put into perspective why we can grow grapes here and make quality wine, but that we're not really making a lot of wine other places within Africa. Of course, wine is made really everywhere, and you certainly see wine coming from Algeria. Morocco has, again, more of a re-emerging wine region with a lot of producers from France that are investing in Moroccan wines as well. But we really think about this area at this confluence of oceans and cool wind and the perfect geographic area, the perfect soil, a lot of these mountain ranges that create all of these microclimates that are perfect for the growing of quality grapes here. But when we think about South African wine, we're really talking about the Western Cape. This is a sort of a geographical unit or geographical area. And the majority of wine grown in the Western Cape is grown in an area known as the coastal region. So we're going to break all of that down in a few moments. But here you can see Africa as a continent, of course. Down here we have South Africa at the very tip. And the wine lands, as they call them, are really located over here near the Cape of Good Hope. So sort of spreading out from the city of Cape Town, which is incredibly important, which we'll talk about as well. And you can see on this map that it's primarily divided into what we call districts in this particular area. So the pink, this is Swartland. You can see it's a pretty large area. Here we have Constantia, really important within this Cape Town. Stellenbosch, Paarl, Wellington, Franschhoek, Robertson. Down here we have Cape Agulhas, and of course, surrounding the city of Hermanus, we have Walker Bay. So these are all regions, and then we're going to talk about districts, and then we're going to talk about wards, which can all be really fun. But you can think about the main wine growing regions really stretch out a little bit east, north, and south from the city of Cape Town, located right over here. So we're going to delve more into that. Talk a little bit about the wine culture, the style. So Rachel, you've been to South Africa. If anybody else has been, please share your experience in the chat. I had the opportunity to travel to South Africa in September of 2019 for about 2.5 weeks with the recipient of WOSA Wines of South Africa, who had a competition in the United States and Canada for sort of like the South African, like Cape Som, like the top sommelier for South African wine. So of course, everybody at Cork Buzz competed, of course, because why wouldn't you compete for a free trip to South Africa? And we didn't win in this particular case, but many of us were so close in the competition that we were actually offered to pay for our plane ticket to South Africa, and then WOSA would take care of everything else. So I had the opportunity to go to South Africa and be a guest of WOSA. And so I've also been to some of these wine growing regions, experienced the hospitality and the beauty of the wine land within this particular place. So the focus on quality, which I think is really important when it comes to understanding the history, is very recent. We had a lot of reasons that quantity was kind of spearheaded as we've gone through, I think, our World of Wine intensive in the past few months. You'll really see that the drive for quantity over quality that happened historically is because of a lot of the same reasons that happen in other wine producing regions in the world. They have unique terroir. They're really beginning to focus on terroir specificity, beginning to focus on a sense of place. But there's still a lot of exploration and still a lot of areas that are actively being discovered today. The top producers are really future focused. We're in the Southern Hemisphere. A lot of these South African winemakers have also become what the Australians coined as the term of flying winemakers, where they have the opportunity to spend a harvest season in the Northern Hemisphere, and it won't take them away from their own harvest. So they have the opportunity to fly to other places within the world, especially in the Northern Hemisphere, and study wine, study grapes, study culture around wine. And we're really beginning to see a little bit of this sort of competition between these, what we call international and local varieties. So local varieties would really be like Pinotage and Steen, which Steen, of course, is Chenin Blanc, but Pinotage is really South Africa's only own grape, which is a crossing that was created here in the 1920s. But they're really seeking a national identity for their wines, and they're seeing a lot of success here as well, which is really exciting. I love what's happening in this place. So let's talk a little bit about the history. It starts in 1655. So the Dutch East India Trading Company, sort of one of the world's first sort of trading monopolies, they send 3 ships with a commander named John van Riebeck to establish a permanent colony on the Cape of Good Hope. So the Dutch have been stopping by this particular area for quite some time, and they really need to establish a base that their sailors can refuel on their trip to the East Indies. So he'd probably, he becomes a historical figure for South Africa. I mean, he was probably a pretty reluctant settler in this new and wild land. He's in his late 20s, his early 30s, going to this place called South Africa. It is visually stunning when they get there. South Africa, I think, is one of the most, especially the Western Cape, is one of the most just stunning wine regions in the world. Just beauty to feast on with your eyes. But he becomes quite popular. And in 1659, he writes in his journal that, praise be God, for the first time that wine had been made from Cape grapes. So he probably brought these cuttings with him in 1655. They made the first wines in 1659. And these wines were simple. They were made for sailors with simple palates to kind of quench their thirst on their trips around the world. And it wasn't until 1685 that Simon van der Stel, who's becomes the second governor of the Cape, he comes and he settles here as well. Now, he has a little bit more experience with growing grapes and winemaking, and he founds his Constantia estate, and he begins to make a wine known as Vin de Constance. So this is a sweet late harvest wine. We don't think it was made with botrytis. We think it was just a later harvest where the sugar had concentrated within the grape. And this wine becomes incredibly sought after within Europe. It becomes very, very popular in this particular time. 1685, we're really predating a lot of the popularity of the wines, even coming from places like Bordeaux or Sauternes. And the wine is really praised by Baudelaire, Jane Austen. Napoleon in exile was rumored to, in his memoir, really only mentioned 3 wines, and those wines were champagne, Chambertin, and Constantia. And apparently he also had a running order of, a continuous stream of the Vindic Constanta sweet wine coming from South Africa to where he was actually exiled. Now, we go through a lot in the early days of this new colony, but in terms of its particular wine region, they were hit pretty late by phylloxera and other American vine diseases like powdery mildew and downy mildew. But they were not able to recover very swiftly. So they were probably hit relatively late because of their isolation in terms of the other wine regions within the world, but they were also very slow to be able to get the information of how to combat phylloxera. They were not able to get a lot of the new rootstock that they needed for replanting. And by the time a lot of these fixes for phylloxera were made available to them, they already had a lot of issues with in their own country. There was a lot of civil war kind of taking place within their own country. There was a lot of taxes coming from the English, of course, and this put a lot of havoc and a lot of stress on the South African export, particularly during this time. So as many New World wine growing regions, we talk about this. Essentially what happened is that you have a lot of growers. I think even today there's probably something like, there's like 10,000, I might be wrong, but I think there's around like 10,000, individual growers in South Africa. But there's only really about 500 wine estates. So you can see that a lot of wine estates or wineries purchase their grapes from smaller growers, which is really fantastic. And I think too, this is really fascinating too, is I wrote it down because I always forget. There are 93,000 hectares of vines in South Africa, in the country. There are 120,000 hectares of vines in Bordeaux. So all of the wineland, all of the vineyards of South Africa are less than just of what we have within Bordeaux. So keep that in mind as well. So in 1918, we form a cooperative called the KWV, is what we'll call this. And this gives all of these growers a place to sell their grapes. So essentially they regulate the market during this time. They give these growers somewhere to sell the grapes. They set quotas essentially, and they say, well, for the domestic market, we need this many grapes to make wine to supply the market. But they would also purchase excess grapes and they would turn it into brandy, or they would produce wine for export. So they were doing a pretty good job. And in the 1920s, they were actually given all regulatory power over the wine growing region and the wine making within South Africa. And essentially this encouraged quantity over quality, unfortunately, because growers had a place to sell their grapes, because growers in South Africa often are farmers and not necessarily winemakers. They weren't really, like as I said, encouraged to produce higher quality grapes. So the wines in this region really began to lag behind a lot of the technological advancements that were happening in the rest of the world. Now, on top of this, we also have in the late 1940s, 1948, I think, National Party takes over and apartheid is instituted. So a system of racial segregation that lasted until 1994. Now, we talk a lot about the tariffs and the embargoes that were against South Africa. Most of the world had embargoes against, or most of the countries of the world, the embargoes against South Africa really were not that long. The United States actually only had an embargo from 1986 to 1991, so only about 5 years. But what really happened within the wine industry within South Africa is that these winemakers didn't have access to technology, to information, to traveling to other places in the world and seeing how wines were being made and the quality of the wine that were being made, the hygiene of the wines that were being made in other places. The KWV is controlling everything during this time. However, in 1973, we do introduce the WO, wine of origin system. So this is our appellation system that we'll talk about. 1990, Nelson Mandela is released from prison. 94, apartheid ends. And in 1997, really important for the wine industry, the KWV is privatized. So the South African Wine Industry Trust is established. This takes over a lot of the regulating of South African wine industry, which we'll talk about that as well. The KWV still exists as a private brand. They're based in Paarl. And in 1998, the IPW is launched. And this encourages sustainable production practices, which we're also going to talk about more actually now because it's so important. So the WO system started in 1973. It's a voluntary certification process. 99% of the wines within South Africa are part of this certification process, the wine of origin certification. So there's 4 types of production areas. The largest would be geographical unit. The third largest would be region. Second largest would be district. And then the smallest would be ward. Not all wards have to be inside of a district. Not all districts have to be inside of a region. Most of the time they do get smaller and they're in the larger appellation above it, but not always. Most often what you see on a bottle of South African wine is the district, which we're going to talk about most often. Something that can be really confusing about how South African wines are labeled is this is labeled as a Western Cape wine. So this is actually labeled with the geographical unit. So in South Africa, if you put a location of where the grapes come from on your bottle, 100% of the grapes have to come from that area. This is different from any other wine region in the world where, in the United States, you say it comes from California, 75% of your grapes have to come from California. If you say it comes from Napa Valley, 85% of your grapes have to come from Napa Valley. But there's a little bit of wiggle room, right? And that doesn't mean all Napa Valley. That doesn't mean Screaming Eagle is always putting, 85% Napa Valley grapes in the bottle and then 15% from, the Central Valley. That's not what we're really talking about, but it allows producers a little bit of flexibility. In South Africa, you have to have 100% of your grapes coming from that particular appellation, that district, that region, that ward. So a lot of even quality producers will essentially declassify their wines, and we can talk a little bit more about why that is in a moment. So there are 75 approved cultivars, what they call grape varieties. All wines must pass scientific tasting and testing. Scientific taste test, they must undergo testing for the cultivar, for the vintage, the age. 85% of the stated grape and vintage are required, and as mentioned before, 100% of the stated production area. Most wines also carry the IPW that we were just talking about. So these wines pass a series of assessments and then are deemed sustainable. So this sustainability covers environmental, social, and economic sustainability. So it's not just about what you're doing with the environment, but also about how your workers are treated, water, also about incorporating a lot of Black initiatives in South Africa as well, which is really quite important. So you'll see this IPW, probably if you're drinking a South African wine, it probably has the IPW seal on it because this is the integrity and sustainability is really important within South Africa as well. So we're going to start looking at some of these regions. So here we're in the Western Cape. So the Western Cape is where almost all of the wine in South Africa is produced. There are a few other regions. It would be unlikely that you would see them, especially in the United States. So we have these different regions within the Western Cape. What we'll talk about primarily today is the coastal region. You'll see a lot of wines that are labeled with coastal region. This would include districts like Paarl, Constantia, Stellenbosch, Swartland. We'll talk about the Breede River Valley. This includes the districts of Robertson, Breede Kloof, Worcester, a really important. Klein Karoo, you're going to see a lot more production of fortified wines in this particular area, not really known for a lot of quality production. Oliphant River, really, really high altitude. You're seeing some great Grenache and so Chenin Blanc coming from this particular area. And then we have the Cape South Coast. So the Cape South Coast, the coastal region, here you have Cape Town. The coastal region is really your most historic area of production. Also, within sort of the Breede River Valley as well. And then the Cape South Coast is where you see a lot of your emerging wine region. So mostly located right down here, places like Cape Agulhas, Elgin, Bot Riviere, and the Hemel and Arda wards of Walker Bay. So much fun stuff, right, guys? So within these regions, you'll find districts. And as I mentioned before, most of the wines that you see coming from South Africa are typically labeled with a district. Now, just like you have to have 100% of your grape coming from an appellation in order to use that on your label, there's something else unique about how you label South African wines. Now, if we were in California, you would often see a wine maybe labeled as Oakville, which is a sub-appellation within Napa Valley, but then that wine will also say Napa Valley. In South Africa, you can only use one geographic designation or one appellation on your bottle. So if, for example, you were looking at a ward within the district of Stellenbosch, maybe, you know, somewhere like Bottery, Banghoek, Simonsburg, Stellenbosch, Papageiberg, Devon Valley, many of these smaller wards that you see in here, you would forfeit the opportunity to also include Stellenbosch on your label. So a lot of people really won't choose to do this as producers because Stellenbosch is one of the most recognizable names in South African wine. So because of this, you don't as often see a wine labeled by a ward. Districts, the older they are, the less terroir specific they tend to be. Wards tend to be the most terroir specific because wards are more or less sort of the younger appellations, the newer appellations that we see within many of these districts. They're usually a little bit more terroir specific, if that makes sense. So if we go back to the former map, here we are again, we're in the Western Cape. And then within the coastal region, you see the districts of Swartland, Darling, Cape Town, Tulbagh, Wellington. Actually, Tulbagh, I think this is an older map. Breede, Paarl, Franschhoek, Stellenbosch, and then moving into the Cape South Coast, Overberg, Swellendam, Cape Agulhas, Walker Bay. And you also have over here, you also have Bot Riviere, which can also be quite important as well. Makes sense, right? We're getting into all these kind of smaller appellations, but we're mostly going to talk about districts. So what do we have in terms of climate, geography, and soil? When we're talking about a country, right? So you can imagine that we have a lot of diversity. Overall, we could certainly call South Africa a Mediterranean climate. In the majority of wine growing regions, we have a hot, dry growing season with more of the rain or precipitation falling during the winter. We usually have a long kind of dry growing season. This is usually what we really prefer for growing vitivinifera grapes, right? We also have the Cape Doctor. Now the Cape Doctor is a cool wind that comes up from Antarctica that really blows right over the Cape of Good Hope. So it kind of comes down from here and really sort of blows, starts hitting here around Cape Agulhas, which is one of the coolest regions for wine in South Africa, and then continues to blow up and over towards Swartland. So Constantia will typically be one of the coolest right here in this little sort of amphitheater, which we'll talk about in a moment, and then Cape Agulhas, where they really get the brunt force of that Cape Doctor wind. It comes through, it cools down the wine growing region. We are in Africa, it's still warm. We're still talking about cool climate regions in a warm country, really. So, you know, always keep in mind, cool climate in Germany is not always the same as a cool climate in South Africa. So always important to keep in mind. Drought can be a major issue here. Now, when we talk about different vintages and whatnot as well, we can certainly consider that, you know, vintage variation and a good vintage and a bad vintage varies on which side of that you're looking at, right? So in South Africa, 2015 to 2018, they experienced pretty severe drought. What this actually does for the grapes is that if the drought doesn't last too long, that it permanently harms the plant itself. This will, you know, decrease yields, but oftentimes increase complexity and flavor within the grape. So we're making less wine, which is bad for a winemaker because they have less product to sell. It's bad for a consumer if we love that wine and we want more of it to be available, but they might actually produce better wine depending, right? Depending on the drought. So 2015 to 2018, we really saw 3 years of pretty severe drought. So severe actually that during this time, especially in places like Cape Town, showers were limited to 90 seconds. So if you go to Cape Town, if you're in places like Stellenbosch, you're in the wineland, you'll probably go into hotels and you'll see timers on the shower. So you can set a timer, remind yourself that you can only be in there for 90 seconds, a minute and a half. There was actually 3 days that were considered to be day zero within Cape Town during the drought in 2017 or 2018, where they thought that they would be completely out of water within Cape Town. And in Elgin, which is sort of in a bowl, a little bit of a depression, and actually gets quite a bit of moisture, they actually had enough water that they loaned Cape Town water so that they would have water to get through those days. We see a huge mix of soils. These are some of the world's oldest, most geologically diverse soils within the world. You see a lot of shale as sort of the underlying predominant soil, with granite, some limestone. We'll talk about that. Really, the limestone in Robertson, so that makes that area really different from the others for growing grapes. We have mountains, we have beaches, we have desert, and really importantly, we have the fynbos. So if you're a Francophile, if you drink a lot of French wine, you're probably familiar with garrigue, that vegetation that grows over the landscape in the south of France. We often say the wines of Châteauneuf-du-Pape, of Côte-du-Rhône, of Provence, of Corsica, they have this garrigue characteristic to them, right? The sort of anise and fennel and lavender and sage and thyme and rosemary characteristic. Well, the fynbos is the South African garrigue. It's a mix of herbs, flowers, succulents, and grasses that covers the Western Cape. And it's really important to understand that when we talk about sustainability within South Africa, there are 6 floral kingdoms in the world. The Cape Floral Kingdom within South Africa is the smallest, but most diverse in the entire world. There are about 10,000 different species of plants, and about almost maybe 20% of that or more is indigenous and found only within the Cape South Coast Floral Kingdom. So really important that we're looking at the environmental sustainability. Let's talk about some of these regions. I haven't seen any questions pop up. How are we doing? Are we having a good time? All right, I am drinking. Let me take a little break here. So talking about South African wine. So we actually had a guest that sent us an email last week, and I was really pleasantly surprised. And she said, I'm looking to purchase 2 cases of South African wines for gifts. So it was a really fun opportunity for us to choose some wines that we are really excited about. So one of those wines that we chose that I'm drinking tonight is a wine called Memento. This is a winemaker named Marylise Newman, and she is creating a lot of what we call Cape blends. So she's looking for blends based predominantly on Chenin Blanc. In this case that we really see, this is, for this vintage, 85% Chenin Blanc, 15% Verdelho. She is declassifying her wine because she's getting grapes from different places and from different vineyards. Now, she doesn't own any of her own vineyards. Now, when you do this, typically you have some long-term contracts, but maybe you'll tend to get a little slice of land offered to you, or sometimes the grower had leftover grapes that somebody else didn't purchase. So they look for somebody to buy these grapes, right? Well, that person could be Marylise buying grapes for her brand Memento. Now, the other thing that means that I wanted to mention earlier is that a lot of producers will label their wine with a larger overarching appellation so that they don't have to deal with changing their label every single year. The only thing that they'll have to change, because if they were to change both the area and the vintage, there would be 2 things that had to be tested, right? So in this case, maybe a winemaker usually gets all of their fruit coming from Stellenbosch, but just in case they might get a little bit from somewhere else next year, they choose to use a larger overarching geographical designation, if that makes sense. So This is also 2014, which I think is really exciting. I love having wines with some age to them. I really like fresh fruit forward wine too, but they really give them, I think, some beautiful depth. I love wines that have great acidity, which Chenin Blanc typically does, even when it comes from South Africa. And we'll have to talk a little bit about some of these grapes that are popular in a few moments. But Chenin Blanc retains its acidity incredibly well, even in a warmer area like South Africa. And when you have a little bit of age to it, it allows the wine to temper a little bit. So you still have that acidity, you still have that freshness to the wine, but it's not the only thing there. There's a lot of interesting sort of like honeyed and nutty, slightly nougaty, some sort of dried tropical fruit to this wine. It's really yummy. So let's talk about some of these regions, right? So let's start in Constantia. I thought I saw something. Okay, good. I was just checking in on the chat again because I saw a couple of things pop up. So let's talk about some of these regions. Constantia, we'll start with one of these historical classic regions. This was one of the first regions to really be established outside of Cape Town by Simon van der Stel. This was the original site of his Constantia estate, which today is split into two estates. So Klein Constantia, and Klein Constantia is really the one that you'll see quite often as well. And then it was also another estate known as Groot Constantia, Klein Constantia, Little Constantia. And it's really this sort of backside of this string of hills and this mountain that we call Table Mountain, which we'll talk about. We've seen a few pictures. I think there's one in the next slide here. So there's about 10 or 12 wineries that are located in this sort of amphitheater. You can certainly see that it's open to False Bay. This is one of the areas that's the most affected by the Cape Doctor. You can really feel it when you're standing in some of these vineyards here in this particular area. We do still see some of these incredible Constantia dessert wines. They're coming from grape what we call Muscadel in this particular area. The grape we know is Muscat, not of Alexandre, Petit Agrand. Sorry, sometimes my memory slips me, but Muscat Petit Agrand. So one of the grapes that's most well known for the fine sweet wines of the world. Of course, sweet wines are not always the most popular in kind of modern wine circles. So we make a lot of other great wines here too. We're primarily looking at white grapes coming from Constantia because of the cooler climate within this particular area. They're really becoming well known for Sauvignon Blanc. Sauvignon Blanc coming from Constantia can be really fresh, mineral. It has a lot of, great kind of sharp herbaceous and herbal characteristic that we would really enjoy coming from this area. We are seeing some producers trying to work with red grapes like Cabernet. It's more difficult, especially Cabernet Sauvignon, to ripen in this cooler climate. So we're seeing more luck with Cabernet Franc, some cool climate Shiraz, and Merlot coming out of this particular area. But if you are visiting Cape Town, then Constantia would probably be one of the areas that you would most likely be able to visit. You can stay many hotels within this area that are quite fantastic. It's only really about a 20-minute drive from Cape Town, depending on where you're at. Durbanville in the north up here is also doing some great sort of bright, crisp Sauvignon Blanc wines as well coming from this particular area. You'll see a lot of single varietal Sauvignon Blanc, but also quite a bit that's blended and a little bit more of a sort of Bordeaux fashion. So seeing that blended with Semillon, probably when that first wine was made in 1659, they think that the first three grapes that were imported, they think, there's no way of being certain, but we think that they were Chenin Blanc, Muscadel, and I said Chenin Blanc, Muscadel, and Semillon, probably the first three. And that's probably what that first wine made in January of 1659 was made from. So you can certainly see the kind of cloudy, rainier climate. Here we're looking at the vineyard of Constantia here. This is the famous Vin de Constance. wine that's really been reinvigorated. You can find this wine. It's still made today. It's a beautiful, luscious style of late harvest sweet wine. Moving to the next of our sort of classic wine regions that we have here. Oh, that's a good question, Jeff. Let's go back. I see a question. So Jeff is asking the purpose of high post trellising on the left. That's a good question. I don't remember if I don't recall if I got the answer to that particular question. I don't remember seeing a lot of bird nest in this particular part of South Africa. They actually have more issues with other types of wildlife. They have a lot of issues, especially if you get a little bit further into the mountains, closer to mountains, so places like Franschhoek and Stellenbosch, with baboons. Baboon can really decimate a vineyard within South Africa. There are a lot of wildlife. You don't really have any big game, of course, in this part of South Africa any longer. They used to, but you could go, if like you were traveling, you could go to Kruger National Park, which is in South Africa, but I think it's more in the Eastern Cape, and see a lot of kind of big game there, which is pretty exciting. But I think this is probably, it probably had more to do with the fact that this is one of the only rainier wine regions. So it could have to do with exposing the fruit to airflow, having enough space there, and probably the adaptability of modern farming. I would say. I'm not, like, just kind of like my take on it. I don't recall mentioning that being mentioned, but that's a good question, Jeff. Moving into Stellenbosch, so also within the coastal region here. So now we're on the northeastern side of False Bay. So we're probably about maybe a 45 minute drive from Cape Town, if I remember correctly. Rachel, you might remember. But Stellenbosch, named for Simon van der Stel, of course. This is, as I mentioned before, sort of the heartland of the South African wine industry. There's around 150 wineries because of its proximity to Cape Town, because of it's a center for viticulture and enology and research. A lot of people study winemaking within Stellenbosch. If you have the opportunity to go to South Africa and you can go to one area, you'll probably go to Stellenbosch. It is a beautiful small town with a really accessible way to see a lot of these other wine regions as well. It is a much warmer climate as we're moving further inland. Stellenbosch is really known for its Bordeaux style wine. So the number one planted grape in South Africa in general is Chenin Blanc. And then one of the questions that we hear a lot in sort of wine studies, or like trying to trick somebody, is like, what's the most planted white grape in Stellenbosch? Well, you would want to say that it's Chenin Blanc, right? Because you're like, oh, well, Chenin Blanc is the most planted grape in South Africa, but it's actually Sauvignon Blanc. So Stellenbosch is really a reflection. It's kind of like, you can say it's like California or the United States Napa Valley. It's like the most well-known area. It's really known for the Mediterranean climate and for Bordeaux grapes, and particularly Bordeaux style blend. So we see a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon coming out of here. We see a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon blend with Cabernet Franc and Merlot particularly. Cabernet Franc is pretty exciting coming from Stellenbosch as well. We have producers like Jenny Povell from Botanica. She makes some great Chenin Blanc, great Cabernet Franc. If you wanted to know what the other wine that we picked for that guest that wanted two cases was, other than the Momento Chenin Blanc blend, the other was a Cabernet Sauvignon blend coming from Stellenbosch, from a winery known as Botanica. We see some older soils here, but more predominantly granite and sandstone. And then the other grape that's really important to talk about within Stellenbosch as well is Pinotage. So we'll talk about Pinotage a little bit longer, a little bit further in, but Pinotage is a crossing of what we would call, at the time we called it Pinot Noir and Hermitage, which is not what we call it anymore. So Pinotage and Cinsault. It's really South Africa's only grape. It's not, of course, indigenous to South Africa, but it was created in South Africa. So we really don't see Pinotage planted anywhere else. And we'll talk a little bit about that further on. But we have some really classic producers within Stellenbosch, working with Pinotage, the most important of which would be Kanoenkop. Kanoenkop is sort of the benchmark for classic Pinotage coming out of this area. A lot of producers are really choosing to work with older Pinotage vines, and making a lot of different styles. Pinotage has sort of suffered in its reputation in the past several decades, but we'll talk about some of those more exciting styles coming up. So Ken Forrester is also located within Stellenbosch, known as Mr. Chenin, the King of Chenin, really focuses on old vine Chenin grown within this particular region. We're really here, you can see some of these old vines at the Ken Forrester estate, and he's really sort of just in the shadows of the Helderberg here as well. So you can see the mountain and the landscape and how they really create all of these, pocket for production. And, as I mentioned, there's 75 approved grapes that you can use for the wine of origin system within South Africa. So it's almost like when we talked about Washington State a few weeks ago, where because of these mountain ranges, they create these microclimates where you can literally grow in South Africa, just like in Washington State, grapes within a single vineyard or within a single district or even ward that would be separated by hundreds of miles within Europe. So it's really an exciting opportunity to see what climate and terroir specificity can really do with a grape variety. We move a little bit further inland, we'll talk about Franschhoek. So Franschhoek means French Quarter in Afrikaans. In the late 1700s, we saw a pretty large influx of about 200 French Huguenot Protestant settlers come into this particular area. Many of them settled within this valley at the time. It's known as the Drakenstein Valley, Dragonstone Valley, later known as Franschhoek, or the French Quarter. It used to be part of Paarl, but achieved its own separate status as a district in 2010. It's surrounded on three sides by mountains. So you really kind of drive into this narrow valley where you have all of these wine estates that sort of backed up against the three mountain ranges that really surround this particular place. They're known for Chenin Blanc, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, but they also have a very small amount, but of some of the oldest Semillon vines within South Africa as well. So it's some pretty exciting things happening there. For a long time, they were really known as sort of the center of South Africa's culinary industry, a lot of fantastic restaurants. It's a really quaint, beautiful town within this particular area. You have great estates like Lamott is here. They have a great nursery, sort of experimental vineyard with lots of different grapes within this particular area. Topiary, a producer from Burgundy that makes particularly Chardonnay and a little bit of Pinot Noir coming out of this particular area as well. Molyneux family wines, we'll talk about a little bit more about them and their projects, Molyneux and Liu Passant in this particular area as well. So you can see you just sort of would drive over from Stellenbosch and down into the Franschhoek Valley. And really the only way to get out is to go back the other way again. It's a beautiful, very small town, one little road in it, with a lot of beautiful shopping, a great place to stay and relax. Paarl is pearl in Afrikaans. There are, I think, 13 official languages in South Africa. So besides, of course, English is an official language, Afrikaans is an official language, things like Zulu are official languages. So there's a lot of languages in this particular area. Paarl is named for a granite outcropping that when it gets wet, when it rains, it glistens like a pearl. It is the second largest granite outcropping in the world after Uluru, or what used to be known as Ayers Rock within Australia, so the second largest in the world. We have a warmer climate here. Paarl is particularly known for Rhone varieties. It's also known as the home of the KWV. Nederburg is also here. Nederburg is one of South Africa's kind of larger wine brands as well. I would imagine, Rachel, you probably saw a lot of Nederburg in London, but you also see quite a bit of it within South Africa, kind of your everyday, sort of inexpensive, more supermarket style wine. But even the KWV and Niederberg, they make clean, correct wine. So I think it's important to consider that, the wines may not be like the epitome of what South Africa offers, but they do make clean, correct wines that are typical of South African styles. You do also see, this is also the home of Pinotage, where Dr. Paarl crossed and so in Pinot Noir for the first time. We have 2 wards within this particular area. You rarely see them on the label, Symonsburg Paarl and the Voor Paardeberg. Voor Paardeberg is right up against the mountain range known as the Paardeberg that separates it from Swartland, which we'll talk about in a moment here as well. We see a lot of producers like Bachberg is here. We see Painted Wolf, which is a favorite brand of mine. They make really fantastic Grenache, Pinotage coming out of this particular region. You'll see a lot of Shiraz and Grenache blends. So you can see the rock here. You can imagine how it would glisten when it gets wet. And this is really exciting too. This is a national monument that's dedicated to the Afrikaans language. And as far as I know, this is what I've heard, although I haven't fact checked it, it's the only monument in the world that's dedicated to a language. So maybe somebody knows of a different one, but I have heard that. Robertson would be considered one of our re-emerging or rediscovered regions. In the Breede River Valley, we are a river valley, so near the river, it's quite fertile, and we do see a larger production of quantity versus quality. But Robertson, which is one of the districts within the Breede River region, is important because it's one of the only areas that really has a large amount of limestone. Because of that, and this limestone, also really fascinating. Another fun fact to know, this limestone, when we think about limestone, usually it comes from, we talk about a lot of fossils from sea life. Usually limestone come from a previous seabed where we see a lot of these fossilized, like oysters, sea urchin, crustaceans, things like that. The calcium carbonate within this area, the limestone, actually come from fossilized termites. So however long ago there was giant mounds of termites within this area, and they actually created this limestone soil, which is pretty fantastic. So Robertson is a pretty dry area, a little bit more desert-like in terms of its climate, but because of that limestone, we do see some good water retention, a little bit more chalk within this particular area. It's also becoming known for the quality, of course, of its Chardonnay, one of the areas really known for Chardonnay here, but also for Cap Classique, which we haven't talked about quite yet either. So Cap Classique is what we call MCC, and it's South Africa's traditional method sparkling wine. So it's really their answer to champagne. Graham Beck is the standard bearer for MCC within South Africa. There was a lot of horse farms within this particular area and still are as well. But Graham Beck has really made a name for sparkling wine, this MCC style in South Africa as well. The wines are absolutely delicious. They're fantastic quality, and they're so cheap. I mean, I don't like to use the word cheap, but you can get it like a 2009, a 2010, 2013 MCC wine coming from Graham Beck for like $25 at the store in New York, $30, maybe a little bit, maybe like $30 or $40. But if you think about the comparison of that to vintage champagne or any other vintage traditional method wine. And I really think these wines can sort of really hold their own in terms of the sparkling wines of the world. So you can see a lineup of the Graham Beck wines here. They also make fantastic entry-level, non-vintage, just white sparkling and rosé sparkling wine can both be really terrific as well. Here we see a little bit of Braai barbecue. That's really common. We'll talk about food in a little bit. And it's quite warm. So you can see the more sort of desert-like sort of scrub brush, sage brush climate that we do have within Robertson as well. Another great estate coming out of Robertson is Springfield, also really well known for the quality of their Chardonnay as well. Now we're moving into our other sort of rediscovered, historically important, but languished in terms of its quality for a while. Now we're in the Swartland, and the Swartland is like the darling of these rediscovered regions. Swartland is the region that piqued my interest in South African wines back in, really in 2015, I would say 2014. I'd had South African wine before, but this was really the region that made me look at South Africa differently. It was in 2015 that I met Jim Clark, who I mentioned earlier, and it was in 2015 that I told him for the first time that I wanted to go to South Africa with him, which finally happened in 2019. So, when you tell people what your dreams are, they do eventually come true. So Swartland is sort of the area that's known for a lot of natural wine producers. Now, when we talk about natural wine in South Africa, it's a little bit different than natural wine that we see coming from France or even from the USA. Typically, we do see small amounts of sulfur, although that is regulated in the natural wines here. But they're really about talking about making these wines without additive, without the excess flavoring of oak, without manipulations and enzymes or things like that you might see in New World wine region to create these different wine styles, right? Swartland is a pretty wide area. Swartland essentially means like black land in Afrikaans. During certain times of the year, they have what they call kind of the rhino bush grass, and it actually turned black, almost looking as if like a fire has swept through this particular area. They were known for a long time for kind of the breadbasket of South Africa as well. A lot of grains grow here, and also known for fortified wines. So what we do have within Swartland, because for a long time, because this was a historical wine producing region, but then because this region also, as I mentioned before, kind of fell off the radar of a lot of wine producers for a long time. And because Stellenbosch was so popular, what happened? Let's talk about Napa or California, right? So you want to become, you're young, you're in your 20s, you think wine is really cool, you want to be a winemaker, you went to school for enology, and now you're like, I'm going to make wine. And you go to Napa Valley, you're like, well, I can't afford to make wine here, unless you come from a winemaking family in Napa. So where do you go? You go somewhere like the Sierra Foothills. So you can think of Stellenbosch like Napa Valley and Swartland like the Sierra Foothills. Land is much less expensive, but also more importantly, there's an abundance of vineyards that are already here. And there's a woman named Rosa Kruger who will go around and sort of finding a lot of these old vine vineyards. Charles Beck, who created the brand, Goats du Rhone, kind of a play on, of course, Côte du Rhone style wine coming from South Africa. He had a young winemaker working for him by the name of Eben Sadi. Eben Sadi really saw what was happening with Rosa Kruger and these old vine vineyards within Swartland. He created his own wine brand called Sadie Family Wine, or Sadi Family Wine, that now became one of the most important producers coming out of the Swartland. So we originally released two wines, a Chenin Blanc based white and a Shiraz based red. These wines are some of the most expensive that you see today coming out of South Africa, but a lot of producers really followed within this particular area. So David and Nadia, Sadi as well, no relation, but same name. Chris and Andrea Molyneux, Andrea is from California. She has the California brand known as Fog Monster. They make really fantastic wines within this area. Three Foxes does some really great things. And they're all members of what we call the SIP, or the Swartland Independent Producers. And this is really kind of a grower association of quality control. So all native yeast, no additions, maximum 25% new oak. They want to use traditional varieties for the Swartland, which include all of your own grapes, Chenin Blanc, and also Tinta Barroca, if you can believe it. So Portuguese grape that also became quite popular in this particular area. We're almost finished. Again, it's 7:33, so I'm sorry to keep you over, but I always have the recording available if you need to jump off, so just email me afterwards. But moving into sort of these newer areas, the Walker Bay, we're moving down into the Cape South Coast region. Walker Bay, if you like whale watching, this is where you'll go. Kind of considered to be the one of the whale watching capitals of the world. If anybody is a Shark Week fan, you know most of the Shark Week filming that you see take place just off of the Cape of Good Hope as well. This includes the districts of Oberberg, Walker Bay, Cape Agulhas, Plettenberg Bay, which is really far away, eastern down the coast. I've never seen a wine come from there. Swellendam and Elgin. Elgin was a former sort of apple growing area that now has producers like Iona, Paul Kluver, Richard Kershaw, the master of wine from London or from England, who has a winery here as well, Kershaw wines, which are really fantastic. But most people are familiar with the Hemel and Arda Valley. So 3 wards within this kind of area known as the Hemel and Arda, Heaven and Earth Valley. And they really became famous from a producer known as Hamilton Russell. And Hamilton Russell really defied the KWV and a lot of the standards that were set in South Africa prior to the privatization of the KWV. It was very difficult to bring in new plant material for grapevines into South Africa. They had to go through a very long and rigorous quarantine, usually up to a decade, sometimes more. They had to be approved. There were quotas based on where and what and how much you could plant. So at this time, you couldn't actually even plant grapes in Elgin and in Walker Bay. So there were not quotas for vineyards here, so you could not plant. So a lot of the planting and a lot of the grapevines were brought in illegally. A lot of the plant material within South Africa during this time, because it was so secluded because of some of those embargoes, was not in very good condition. So you have producers who brought in suitcase vines, just brought in vine material in their suitcase from places in Burgundy, and they planted them here especially in Walker Bay, in the Hemel and Arda Valley. Today it's known as sort of the answer to Burgundy. We're really talking about Chardonnay, Pinot Noir out of this particular place, but Hamilton Russell has really made most important within this particular area. Many of the producers that have branched off from Hamilton and Russell that have worked for them in the past have created their own wine brand within this particular area. That would include, I think really importantly, Tesselarsdale, which is a really fantastic wine brand coming from this place. I really love Storm Wines. We have at Cork Buzz as well, creating great Pinot Noir coming from this particular area as well. And they do a little bit of Pinotage too, which I think is really kind of fun. But we're really talking about a very Burgundian, cool climate style of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay coming from this particular area. And when you see the 3 wards, there are producers like Storm who actually bottle a Pinot Noir in each ward. So you can see those climatic differences as you move from the valley to the ridge, which I think is pretty cool, like the ridge and upper Hemel and Arda. So you can see this is Babylonston, and then of course Walker Bay. No whales out today. Elgin, we kind of mentioned, we're going back west up the coast to Elgin. This is sort of a bowl. So Elgin is that area that donated water to Cape Town during their time of need during the drought. Because you have a little bit of a depression in the land, you have this bowl. Elgin tends to get a lot of cloud cover. So it's really quite rainy here. This was an area really known for apples up until I think the late 1990s when we began to plant grapes within this particular area. We see some Chardonnay, some Sauvignon Blanc, a lot of Riesling. Paul Kluwer does some great Riesling here, including some late harvest style. And also I think what's really exciting is Syrah coming from Elgin can be really elegant and peppery. I think when you see Syrah in South Africa, we usually refer to it or see it referred to as Shiraz, the kind of New World style. And just like in Australia, I think a producer is really making a statement when they choose to use the term Syrah on their label instead of Shiraz, telling you that it's made in more of that cool climate, old world style. So, peppery, a little bit more tart fruit to it, maybe slightly more meaty and characteristic than you might get from a warmer area. You can think, of course, somewhere like Swartland, which is much warmer and is more known for those Rhone varieties, or Paarl. You'll get more of that sort of Southern French style, right? That sort of warmer Mediterranean climate style coming out of this particular area. Pinotage, I promised we'd talk about. Really important. Was created in 1921. Didn't become famous until after Dr. Paarl's death. Somebody found this vine that he had planted in his garden outside of his office, and they decided to propagate the grape. So first came onto the market in 1961 with Lanzerac. It's been very controversial. Jeff, you mentioned this earlier. Pinotage, big question mark. It can be made in a lot of different styles. Pinotage for a long time was associated with a little bit of the poor quality of winemaking, especially in the 1990s when we just after apartheid, when we didn't have a lot of the technology that we needed within South Africa. We didn't have a lot of the exposure to more modern and current wine styles within South Africa. And when we first got that exposure and we saw what was happening in other places in the world in the 90s, we're talking about oak, we're talking about big, we're talking about alcohol, talking about, big impression wines. And this is what we tried to make with Pinotage. So a lot of those early Pinotage in the 90s that came onto the market were alcohol, right? High alcohol, lots of oak, lots of extraction. And Pinotage can actually be quite a delicate grape. When you think about the fact we're making this big, bold, like I said, alcohol wine coming from Pinotage, but it's a crossing of Cinsault, which is also a pretty light grape, and Pinot Noir, which is a light, thin-skinned grape. So Pinotage, I think, really has these, when it's made carefully, it's a little bit more like Pinot Noir or Cinsault. It does tend to have more body than Pinot Noir does, and sometimes a little bit more dark fruit. But I really like some of these sort of lighter, fresher styles from David and Nadia, Southern Rite, that are coming onto the market. Fram Wine does some really great styles as well. And also one of the issues that was always associated with Pinotage was this sort of kind of like barbecue aroma, sort of a little bit too smoky. And they actually began to attribute this to the fact that they would char the post within the vineyard to allow these to we have wires in the vineyard, but the ends are held up by wooden posts. So termites would get to these wooden posts. So we would actually char the post to get rid of or to deter termites from eating the post and then collapsing the row of vines, of course, because they're attached to this trellis. And they attributed some of that smoky characteristic, one, to poor hygiene in the winery before we really were able to catch up on newer methods of production, but also to the breaking down of these charred posts within the vineyard as well. They were getting tracked onto the skins of the grape and they were getting tracked into the winery itself as well. It's one of the theories about why these wines could have tasted the way that they did in the 90s and the early 2000s. Thanks for sticking with me, guys. I'm so sorry. I should have known that I would go over on a South Africa class, as I always do. But thanks for sticking it out. So, of course, we have this mosaic culture that I mentioned, 13 official languages. The wineland's incredibly beautiful. South Africa is about or more than just the wineland, of course. There's a lot of diversity there. We talked about the Cape Floral Kingdom, incredibly diverse. If you go to South Africa, you will eat braai. You will have braai every day. It is their barbecue. It is a way of life. They have a national day to braai, and you will have, wonderful Chenin Blanc that will be kind of fresh and crisp. Chenin is made in a variety of styles in South Africa because of the abundance of the grape that's there. It's important to understand that there is more old vine Chenin Blanc in South Africa than there is Chenin Blanc in France or in the Loire Valley period. So they have more old vine Chenin Blanc, just old vine Chenin Blanc, than they have Chenin Blanc in France. So this is really an important grape. It's made in a wide range of styles. So you do get oak styles of Chenin Blanc. You do get these beautiful crisp mineral styles of Chenin Blanc. The one that I'm drinking is a little bit richer. It has some of that honeyed nuanced characteristic that has some of those more savory components that's coming from the age and from the blend with Verdelho as well. After you have your braai, your lunch, your Chenin Blanc to wash it all down, you'll probably play Boer Sport, which is kind of a sports of fun and games. You can see me over here playing some Boer Sport, where essentially we were building towers out of wine corks that couldn't fall over. And once you got your tower out of wine cork built, when it didn't fall over, and of course you've been drinking, of course, as well, so this is fun, then you have to push a barrel through an obstacle course. So a lot of fun things to sort of engage with the people around you. And then of course, everywhere you go, you'll see the protea flower. It's a symbol of hope in South Africa, and also their national flower, which I think is really beautiful. The last thing we're going to talk about, unless you have any questions. So, and I'll send you all of this information. I have a whole bunch of fun things to send you about South Africa when we follow up tomorrow. But, you know, as I mentioned earlier, really the sustainability in South Africa with the IPW seal, of course, is incredibly important, but they have a lot of initiatives. They celebrate Black economic empowerment. They have the Cape Winemakers Protege family, which brings in younger Black winemakers. The Pinotage Youth Development Academy, they're really important to them is establishing Black-owned brands. And something I think, you know, when we went through, that's such a terrible understatement. But, you know, if we think back to June when we really talking a lot about the racial injustice that are still going on within the United States. I know South Africa really is a place that we can look to see how they've dealt with their history, breaking down these political barriers, redressing these historical wrongs. And they really are working with a lot of education and initiatives to try to right some of these historical wrongs. They're striving to be representative of their entire population within this particular region, within this particular part of the world and this country. So it's really a great place to look to. They celebrate Black-owned brands. If you go onto the WOSA website, they have a list of Black-owned brands that you can purchase from, you can look for within this particular area. Tesla that's great, of course. Estelina is really well-known. Bozeman is really well-known, but they have about over 60 Black-owned brands in South Africa, which is really fantastic, I think, as well. So lots of fun stuff happening. How's everybody doing? Sorry to keep everybody so late tonight. Any questions? How are we doing? Everybody's looking good. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. I'm going to send out some fun follow-up tomorrow. I think links to the WOSA site, as I mentioned, if you want to learn more. It's a great book that was just released by Jim Clark. I mean, I think this is really, there's a couple of MSs and some MWs that do some great stuff with South Africa, but Jim Clark just wrote sort of the definitive guide. It just came out a few months ago on South Africa, so really up to date. I got this at my local bookstore here in Fort Greene. So I'll certainly, you know, let everybody know about all these fantastic things. If you have questions about South African wine, please let me know. I'm happy to talk about what I find to be some of the really fantastic brands coming out of South Africa. So thank you, everybody. Have a good night. I'll see you soon. On Thursday, we have our last World of Wine intensive class, Fortified Wines, an excellent way to finish off the series. So I'll see everybody soon. Thank you. Have a good night.